I think most of the time when we think of IT security and we think about attacks, we just got done a whole unit about different types of attacks. A lot of us think of somebody sitting in a dark room, pushing buttons on a keyboard and trying to break into firewalls and routers and get into computers and all this other nefarious stuff that we talk about. But far too often, it's a lot easier than that. It takes a tremendous amount of technical skill to break into a network with computers, but to break into a building or to get information from people is significantly easier. I think it's something that a lot of us do, and it's a skill that I think is inherently in a lot of us already. I think every day we all manipulate people. So, this idea of being able to trick people and manipulate people and even con people is basically what social engineering is all about. So, when we discuss social engineering, we're basically talking about pulling a con, essentially, right? Trying to trick somebody into giving us information, which is a lot easier sometimes than some of the other methods that we talk about. So the basic definition of social engineering is convincing an unauthorized individual to provide confidential information or access to an unauthorized individual. And it's usually through some kind of deceptive practices. And we're going to talk about some of the tools that are available to do this, some of the social and psychological tools that you have when you're trying to use social engineering to trick people into getting you to do something. And I think a lot of us are probably, again, intuitively familiar with a lot of these techniques. Either we use them without even knowing it. Again, it's human nature. Humans are sort of trained and wired to get things, to know how to get things from other people by using these different social techniques and taking advantage of some of these things. One thing I always think about is going out to buy something. When you're dealing with a salesperson's job is to try to manipulate you and into wanting to buy something. And that's not to say salespeople are bad people, but it's certainly good to be aware of those techniques that salespeople use, so you're a little more impervious to them trying to convince you to buy something. I've taken some sales classes over the years and have learned how to do sales, even though I'm not a salesman. And probably the most important thing I've gotten out of that stuff is knowing what their tactics are, and then I know when somebody's trying to sell me something, and I know what to take with a grain of salt. But social engineering is, again, very much about using all of this knowledge we have about psychology and social interaction to take advantage of people, being able to get information that we need, which, of course, in IT security is really important. Any little bit of information we can get is certainly pretty important. So we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff. Another term I like to use for social engineering is human hacking, right? We talk about hacking computers or hacking hardware and all that sort of thing, but we can hack humans as well. And social engineering to me is kind of like human hacking. One of my favorite quotes about social engineering, why is it so important for us to understand social engineering, and why is it used so extensively in attacks? And I think if you look at any major attack, if you look at any major IT security incident, there's always some social engineering aspect to it. There's always something that they had to get that wasn't technical, but was more of was maybe technical information, but it wasn't acquired through technical means. It was more through some kind of social engineering. And Kevin Mitnick, who is a pretty famous hacker, he wrote two good books that I can highly recommend. One is The Art of Deception, and the other one is The Art of Intrusion. They're both good books if you're into IT security, which hopefully you are since you're taking this class. One of his quotes in The Art of Deception is, "It is much easier to trick someone into giving a password than it is to spend the effort to crack the system." We talked about all the different ways you can crack a password. We talked about rainbow tables and dictionary attacks and all that sort of thing. And I talked about how difficult they can be because you have to try to guess these very complicated passwords. But what if going through all of that, instead you just ask somebody, "What's your password?" And they told you. I know it sounds too good to be true, right? It sounds too easy to just ask somebody for their password. Um, but if you're confident and you've got some background information, it's really not that hard to get somebody to give you this type of information. And I think if you experiment with this, you'll find that it's actually kind of true. And speaking of some pop culture stuff, there was a movie in 1994 called The Paper. And I think there's a great demonstration of a social engineering attack. And we talk about this idea of confidence. And in this movie, here's a great line. I'll play it for you here, although you may not be able to hear it too well through the audio, but I'll play it for you. So he says, "A clipboard and a confident wave will get you into any building in the world. So he uses confidence. This is really social engineering in action. So take a look what he does here. He has no business sneaking into this police station. There's a confident wave, the clipboard, and they're in. Nobody asks a question. So that's a pretty common method of being able to sneak in. And you can try that. You as long as you're confident, you act like you're supposed to be there, and a lot of times they just let you through. Um, so there's that quote from that movie. Again, it was from the paper in 1984. A clipboard and a confident wave will get you in any building in the world. Something to keep in mind, not only when you're trying to fit in or get in somewhere, but when you're looking at your own organization's security. Think about how easy it would be for somebody to break in using some of these techniques that we're going to talk about. So let's get started. Let's talk about how social engineering works. There are two major principles for social engineering to work. The first is that most people want to be helpful. Most of us inherently trust each other and we want to be helpful with each other. So we can use this inherent need to want to be helpful to other people in our favor. Think about the panhandler on the street. If I just walked up to you and said, "Give me $5," you're going to tell me, "No, I'm not going to give you $5," right? But panhandlers somehow are able to do that, and it's because they're good social engineers. They know how to prey on people's want to be helpful. And there's lots of reasons that we like to be helpful, but they know how to do that. They know how to take advantage of that. And most con artists can do that as well. Most people also want to avoid confrontation. So this is the other side of this. A lot of people don't want to have any confrontation, and panhandlers are also good at this. I can't tell you how many times you're at the train station. When I'm at the train station in Philly, 30th Street Station, right around the corner from the college, and somebody will come up to me and say, "Hey, I need bus fare. I lost my ticket for the train or whatever. Can you give me $1 or $2?" And I know they're lying. I know that they're just trying to get my money. But sometimes you just don't want to be confrontational, so you just give them the money and you move on instead of getting into an argument with them. So confrontation, it's something else. A lot of us try to avoid confrontation, or you just don't have time for confrontation. But this can be exacerbated in the work environment because you don't want to be seen as somebody who's confrontational with coworkers and things like that. You don't want to cause any kind of trouble with your boss or anything like that. So usually we want to try to avoid confrontation. So this can be you can really use this to your advantage in a workplace, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But let's talk about these various tools that we have at our disposal when we're doing social engineering attacks. So when you think about these different tools, we can almost apply all these. Your book has some good examples, and they explain all these different tools of social engineering. But if you stay up real late one night and watch a couple infomercials, you'll pretty much see all these tools in social engineering. Those infomercials are trying to manipulate us into buying stuff, right? And they're really just social engineering techniques when you think about it, all those infomercials. So, for example, authority. So in your book, they talk about if an attacker can convince others that they have some authority in a particular situation, that they can entice them to act in a particular manner. So, for example, if the boss is requesting something, you're kind of using their boss's authority to get what you want. In an infomercial, think about authority. They bring people on, for example, they're selling some kind of a miracle diet. They bring on a doctor that tells everybody how this diet is going to cure you of every disease that you've had. It's an example of using authority. Intimidation. It could be through perceived power, or it can be more direct. I'll give you an example of intimidation. Your book talks a little bit about it, but a good example is if you, John Stossel, who's a reporter, used to be a reporter on ABC News. He did a piece one time where he dressed up like a police officer to see how people would treat him, and he kind of used that to intimidate people a little bit, and just to see if they would believe that he was a police officer, and it kind of worked. So a social engineer could do the same thing, and they could take on the role of somebody that could be that could intimidate someone, as opposed to being an authority figure. So consensus, social proof. Again, go back to the infomercial. One of their techniques is to have a studio audience that's all clapping and singing the praises of whatever it is they're selling, and they'll even sometimes make it seem like they're all buying the product, even though they're all just actors. So that's an example of consensus or social proof. It's where if people see other people doing it, they're going to think that that this is something that they should do. So a social engineer could certainly use that as one of their tools to get what they want. Scarcity. Again, Back to the infomercial. They do this all the time, right? They say we only have a limited supply. We have 1,000 of these. You see these all the time on those commercials for, like coins and things from the Franklin Mint or something like that, where they say, we've only made 150 of these, or it's a limited run or something like that. So you feel like you have to get it because there's not many left, even though, you know, um, we probably all know that there's probably enough to go around for things like that. So scarcity is another technique. Another one is urgency. Again, if you watch some of these infomercials late at night, they'll have a little timer on the bottom of the screen. You have 5 minutes left to order the product. And the funny thing is the next night the same infomercial's on and it's still 5 minutes, right? So it's not real urgency. I would always be suspect of any deal that where somebody's trying to build up some fake urgency. Good example is I own a home, and every time I ever have somebody come and quote me something for my home, let's say I need a new window or siding or a carpet or a roof or whatever, the salespeople will always come over and they give you some astronomical quote, and then they say, but if you do it today, if you do it right now and sign it right now, I'll do it for half that price. But you have to do it right now because if you call me tomorrow, I won't give you this price. And I can almost guarantee you that, and I've done it before, they leave the house. They tell you, sorry, I can't give you that price. Have a nice day. They call you a week later and they'll still give you that price. So, it's kind of a fake urgency. But urgency is, again, a great technique. You make somebody feel like it has to get done now. They're not going to think through. They're not going to think it is through as much, and they're probably going to go and do whatever it is you're trying to get them to do. So, again, that's another technique, urgency. Familiarity. People do things for people that they like or they feel connected to. So building some kind of a sense of familiarity, and this is again a classic social engineering technique, is trying to get somebody to like you, right? Smile at the right times, and try to be likable. Ask about their personal life, things like that. So if you make them feel like they're your friend, then they're probably going to be more likely to give you what you want. And again, I think a lot of us do this intuitively, right? A lot of us are friendly to people when we're trying to get what we want from that person. So this is not unheard of, really, using familiarity to get what you want. But it's one of our tools in social engineering. And the last one your book talks about is trust. So if somebody implicitly trusts somebody, they're going to be more likely to do what that person is telling them to do. So if and in social engineering, if you can convince somebody that you're in a position of trust, then you can get them to do what you're trying to. You can get them to do what you want them to do. So these are the basic tools that we have at our disposal for social engineering. So let's talk about some of the methods. So all these various methods that I'm going to talk about will employ lots of these different tools. And a good social engineer, somebody who's good at this manipulation, and think about a con artist, right? A con artist knows exactly which one of those tools to pull out at exactly the right time. So they know when to pull the authority. They know when to try to use trust. They know when to use the familiarity. They know how to combine all these things. They're experts on how to do that, which makes them so good at the at conning somebody. So social engineering methods, they typically involve lots of steps. So when I talk about all these different steps, if somebody's going to pull off a social engineering attack where they're trying to get some information, in many cases, you're going to mix and match a lot of these different tools and methods to get what you need. And it's going to be very incremental. So you might start with dumpster diving to get some background information, and then use that when you call somebody to make it seem like you work at the company. And then when you show up, you can use the information you got from the phone call. So you can just keep building and building and building on this information. So again, it'll be very incremental. A good working culture is going to have a lot of the characteristics that also make it susceptible to the tools that I described. So, if you think about a company, being trusting of people and being helpful and not wanting to be confrontational, these are all good qualities you want in people that you work with. But these are also the qualities that make it easier for social engineering attacks. So they kind of, you kind of have to use a lot of training to kind of overcome that. But we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Good social engineers, they understand body language and they know how to read people. So again, just like a confidence man or a con artist, they're very good at reading people. They're good at knowing how to use these tools. So social engineering or social interactions between men and women, or the customer and the salesman, or maybe the panhandler and the pedestrian. These are good examples to look at to see how social engineering works. So, and your book even talks about the interaction between men and women and how we can women can use certain qualities to get what they want from men, and so forth and so on. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with how that could work. I think we all know the realities of how that can happen. So let's talk about the first method your book discusses, which is shoulder surfing. So shoulder surfing is observing an individual entering some kind of sensitive information. So you could do that by looking over someone's shoulder. They could mount a camera behind that person or a webcam somewhere. There's been some attacks over the years where they use this at ATM machines, so they'll skim a card at the ATM machine, but to get the ATM PIN code, they mount a camera somewhere and watch the person entering their code. Or they could sit across the parking lot with a pair of binoculars, watching people to try to get that, or watching somebody type on a keyboard to get their password. And shoulder surfing or looking at somebody type their password on a keyboard is not that hard, especially if you watch them do it a couple times. You can figure out what someone's password is. So how do we counter this? How do we keep this from happening in an organization? Well, there's two things we can do: training, and all the things we're going to talk about. Training is pretty much the major way we can overcome some of this stuff. But for this, obfuscation. I use the term obfuscation, meaning training people to not let somebody look at them entering their password. Think about when you go to an ATM machine. If somebody's behind you and you're using the ATM machine, you probably stand in such a way that they can't see you entering your PIN number. So things like that can help prevent people from using shoulder surfing to get that sensitive information. And by the way, it doesn't have to just be on computers, right? You can watch somebody writing on a pad, or writing in their computer. You can watch what they're typing, things like that. So lots of ways to do shoulder surfing. Another example is dumpster diving. So it's going through a target's trash hoping to find valuable information. I don't know that I really classify this as social engineering, but in our book they talk about it in this section on social engineering. So the idea is that you can find sensitive information in the trash can, and what kinds of things can we find? Well, I mean, you could find really good stuff like passwords and things, but that's probably not as common. But what you could find is, let's say you're trying to break into a network. Well, it might be useful to know what kinds of firewalls they use or what types of equipment they have. Well, if you go in the trash, you might find old manuals. You could find receipts. You could find invoices and things like that. Memos that might talk about some of these things. More importantly, if you look at memos, it gives you some insight into the organization, so you can start to understand a little bit about the organization, the hierarchy, some of the lingo, so that you can fit in even better when you do. And I talked about social engineering as sort of this incremental thing where you're constantly you're getting a little bit of information, then you're using that to get a little bit more, and then you're using that to get a little bit more. So dumpster diving is a pretty good first step to getting that information. So there could be a lot of very dangerous information in the dumpster. A lot of students, when I teach a class like this in person, will say, well, is this even legal? Are you allowed to just go through somebody's trash? I mean, isn't that illegal? And it is actually legal in most cases. So there was a Supreme Court case in 1988. It was California versus Greenwood. And in that Supreme Court case, they ruled that trash, once you discard something and put it in the trash can, it becomes public domain. In other words, property of the public, right? The town or the city is going to come pick up that trash can and bring it to the dump anyway. So they considered that public domain. So anybody really could go through the trash. Now, there are some local ordinances that prevent you from doing dumpster diving. So, for example, in the town that I live, you are not allowed to pick trash because they sell the trash, right? So if you throw out an old refrigerator, there's a lot of scrap iron or scrap metal in that refrigerator. They don't want people coming around and picking up that that old refrigerator and turning it into the scrap yard, when the township could have picked it up and turned it into the scrap yard and saved us tax dollars a little bit of money. So frequently you'll see signs that things like that are illegal. The thing is, I've never seen that enforced. I see these guys drive around in old pickup trucks all the time, picking up trash on the curb before the township has a chance to come and pick it up. So I don't know that it's really enforced in most cases. So, just because it's illegal in your jurisdiction doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. So you can't trust that because there's a law against dumpster diving that you can just throw out whatever you want and you don't have to worry about somebody going and getting it. So bits of information can be used indirectly. Perhaps in other social engineering attacks, inside information, which I just talked about. So somebody could use this information incrementally in further attacks later on. In other words, knowing the names of people, knowing maybe a little bit about them. If you find a memo that talks about somebody's personal life, you could say, hey, I heard, such and such. I heard you just sold your house, or I heard you just bought a new dog, or whatever. It seems like you belong. So You can use that to build the trust and the familiarity. So you can kind of see how this can be incremental. Usually dumpster diving, it's a classic technique used for ID theft. Private investigators use it because you don't need a warrant or anything like that. It's usually not illegal. Law enforcement uses it. It's an easy way to get information. How do we counter people from getting information from us through dumpster diving? Well, one is having policies for discarding sensitive information. So using shredding, or hiring companies that can dispose of this stuff for you safely, and through training, telling people what they should and should not throw away, and training people to understand that sometimes people will know this information about them because of dumpster diving. It's not, you can't always just trust people. And again, training is important for all of these different techniques that we talk about for social engineering. So another method we talk about is tailgating. The idea behind tailgating is when you follow somebody closely, or you follow closely behind someone when you're trying to gain access to a restricted area. So basically, you can follow somebody through the door, and I think we've all done this, especially if one of the when I teach at the college on campus, everybody does this all the time, right? You got your Drexel card to your Dragon card to get into the dorm room or the dorm building. If you forgot your card, you just wait until somebody else comes along and opens the door, and you just follow them through. And how often does somebody actually stop you and say, hey, do you have a Drexel Dragon card? Are you allowed to go through this door? Are you allowed in this building? Very rarely. People don't usually do that, even though they probably should, because it could be anybody, right? So this is a very easy technique, and I think we've all probably done this. I know I've done this many times. You forget your key or whatever, you can just follow somebody through, and most of the time they won't even know. You can even do this in, I was in a store not long ago, one of those big box stores, and had to use the bathroom, and they didn't have a bathroom in this particular. It might have been a drugstore, I think, maybe a Rite Aid or something like that. So I just followed an employee into the back room to go use the bathroom. They didn't question me. I just, walked right in, right behind them when they opened the door. So you can certainly do things like this. And now there's evidence on YouTube that I did that. But one common tactic your book talks about is carrying something heavy, so that they even hold the door for you, right? And this goes back to the idea that people want to be helpful, right? So you see somebody carrying a heavy box and struggling with it. You're going through the door. You're going to instinctively want to just hold the door open. So if you want to make it even more likely that you're going to be able to tailgate through a door, carry something heavy with you, and the person will see you and say, "Oh, I'll hold the door for you," and let you through. It's just common decency. And again, it's because we're inherently trusting of people and we want to be helpful. So how do we counter all this stuff? Well, first of all, training. This all goes back to training. But requiring identification is a good idea. So having some policy that requires that people wear identification or display their identification in order to get into restricted areas, and more importantly than that, make sure that you maintain a culture where that's normal. Right? Think about that dorm building I was talking about on campus. That's not part of the culture to ask people for their Dragon card. You don't see students typically asking other students to see their Dragon card, right? But you could, the college could have some kind of campaign, and maybe they have already, and by the time you listen to this, they did, but the college could have some kind of campaign that says, hey, don't let people into the building. There's been, some thefts or, you're worse, and always ask people to see their Dragon card when they're in the building, and you can build a culture where that's acceptable. And once you do that, once you build that culture where it's acceptable for asking for people's identification inside restricted areas, then if somebody acts like they're surprised or acts insulted that you're asking for their identification, then they're going to be suspicious because they're going to say, well, this person should know that this is something normally that we all do. We all ask for each other's IDs when we don't recognize someone. So you'll know that something's not right. So again, those are some techniques we can use to prevent tailgating attacks. Another technique that your book talks about is impersonation. Lots of different ways we can impersonate, but basically it's when the attacker assumes a role that's going to be recognized by the victim. There we go with the familiarity, right? So this could be familiarity, this could be authority, and so forth. So a couple different ones they talk about. One is third-party authorization. So this is where the attacker uses information that they already know to validate themselves. And again, this could have come from dumpster diving, right? They could have used the dumpster diving and figured out some information to basically present some third-party authorization. Let me give you an example of this. Somebody might say, Mr. Jones said that you would help me with this. So they might do some name dropping. They might use a project, some kind of known project, and bring that up as if to give them authorization. And they might have something with them, or they might mention something that you would expect, so they start to fit in and you get that familiarity. So that's third-party authorization, where you're kind of leveraging a third party for authorization, and even though you really don't have that authorization, but that person doesn't know that, but they're like, well, they know about this, so they must be authorized. Another example, they talk about support in your textbook. So, and this goes two ways. Either you can call the help desk and pretend to need help and get information from the help desk that you need, or you can go the other way around. You can call somebody and pose as the help desk to get information. This is one of the really common scams right now. And I don't know if any of you guys have gotten this, but your cell phone will ring and it'll be somebody on the other end of the line that will say, hi, we're calling from such and such support. We saw a message from your computer that you're infected with a virus. We'd like to help you fix that. Are you near your computer? So, and then the person says, oh yeah, my computer has been running a little slow lately. And then they basically walk you through going to a website where they can get remote access to your computer. And then from there, they've got control of your computer and, they can install whatever they want. And all those other attacks that we talked about earlier become possible. So that's, and again, that's an authority thing, right? You're trying to either presenting that you have the authority to do that, or you're using somebody, you're avoiding confrontation and things like that. So all those techniques that we talked about. Another example is posing as a contractor. So a real simple example is you might put on a uniform like you're the office cleaner and just walk in and pretend like you're cleaning an office and use that to collect information. So that's another example. All this stuff can be done online, so you can use email and IM. IM is especially effective now because a lot of companies are starting to use their own IM clients or their own IM software. And if the attacker can somehow get access to that IM system, so for example, if a company is using Google Apps, it's really not hard to get to make it appear as though you're part of that company through their Google Apps account. All you have to do is friend somebody, friend that person through Google Chat, and they may not know that you're really not in the same network. You're not really in the same, it's not really within the organization. But because they're so used to people they work with, IMing them with that client, they're going to think that they work with you. They're going to think you're working the company. So you've already established that familiarity. You've already established that you're part of the organization, even though you're not. So IM has certainly become something to be careful of. Although IM is great, there's a lot of great things about IM, but it's certainly one of those things that people could take advantage of. So we can counter this through training, requiring IDs. Like we said before, they're trying to pass themselves off as someone else. So if you require an ID that hopefully they wouldn't have, and again, like before, maintain a culture where this is something that's normal. So the next thing we talk about is a hoax. And this is kind of one of those things that seems like it's more of a nuisance than it is a social engineering attack. But basically, a hoax is a humorous deception. Or I put humorous in quotes because it's supposed to be a humorous deception, or it's, something that, a hoax is not always supposed to be something that's malicious, but usually there is some portion of malicious intent in a hoax. Though seemingly innocuous, they can inflict significant harm. One of the examples your textbook talks about is the hoax years ago where these emails were going out telling people that there were certain files in Windows that were viruses, and people would go and delete those files. But it turns out they weren't viruses. They were actually important libraries and things that's part of Windows. So they're deleting DLLs and the NT kernel and things like that, and then their computer would stop working. And maybe that is a humorous deception if you're doing it to somebody's personal computer and it's a friend, and maybe it is kind of a humorous hoax. But in the business world, if you've got 500 computers and half those people end up doing it when they get that mass email, you're going to have a pretty bad day in the IT department. So it can cause significant harm. So you counter this through training. You tell people, don't believe this stuff. Never delete anything on the computer in this folder without talking to somebody. Things like that. So again, a lot of this stuff we have to counter through training. So the next is whaling. So we talked about spear phishing before, which is where we're phishing. By the way, phishing should have been spelled with a PH. Sorry about that. But basically, spear phishing was when we're going after a specific target. But whaling is spear phishing, but where the target is a high-value target. So this could be a C-level employee, somebody in the C-suite, right? A CIO, CTO, CEO, CFO, CMIO, whatever, some C something O, some kind of officer that has sensitive information, it's usually much more focused and very well planned. So these C-level employees, people who are CEOs and so forth, they're just as likely to fall for these cons as anybody. So how do we counter that? Through training, just like everything else. We counter this through training, make sure people are aware of these techniques and know when to ask for ID, know when to be suspicious of these things. So again, we can counter a lot of this through training. The last one that's discussed in your book, the last technique they talk about or method of social engineering is vishing. We've already discussed this previously, right? We already talked about vishing in the previous unit, but where it applies to social engineering is that we talked about how vishing you can use voice over IP to spoof caller ID, and a lot of folks when they see a caller ID, they assume that that's really the number that someone's calling from, but it may not be. So you can use that caller ID to establish trust. So you can use that number that shows up on the caller ID. Somebody can say, "Oh, I know who that is," or "I know where that number is coming from. I know that's somebody at the office," or I know that's the other company down the street," or so forth and so on. So if you want to establish yourself as being a part of an organization, a great way to do that is to spoof the caller ID, so it further enhances that image or that con. So we've talked about lots of different social engineering techniques in this unit. I was going to show you. This is again, you can watch this on YouTube, and I'll post a link I think for this. But this is this was a movie back in, I think it was in the late '90s, maybe early 2000s, with Robert Redford, called Sneakers. And one of my favorite scenes in this movie, there's a 2-minute scene that I'll play. He's trying to break into an office, and they use a lot of the social engineering techniques that we just talked about. So if you take a look at this, here's Robert Redford going in saying that he's looking for a delivery, or he's trying to get in to see something, but this guy's already distracted by that delivery man, and that delivery man is part of the con. He's another one of these con artists trying to help him get into the building. So he distracts him with an argument. You can see these guys are arguing, and then here comes Robert Redford. He's got the balloons and everything. So he's going to take advantage of his willingness to help, that human nature to want to be helpful, to get him to open that door. So he's going to buzz him in. There he goes. So that worked. So now he gets into the building. Once he gets in the building, he doesn't want to raise any suspicion. So the next part is he tries to fit in. So he ditches the balloons. He ditches the fake cake. And inside there, he's got a briefcase. So now he can pretend like he works there and he belongs. Now he's going to get to the door, but something's wrong. He's got a keypad, and he's got to break through that door. Now remember what Kevin Mitnick said. He said, sometimes there's a much easier way to break in than the technical aspect, right? So here he is asking these guys, how do I break through this keypad? And they're going to give him some pretty intricate instructions here on how to crack that keypad on the door, which is very difficult. It's very difficult to crack a keypad. I mean, how do you do that standing in a hallway? You can't exactly brute force that in the hallway. It's going to take a couple hours, right? Unless you get lucky. Or you could watch somebody enter their code, right? That'd be shoulder surfing. So that would be a technique you could employ. All right. So all those instructions, who knows what they're telling him to do? It's, in some kind of earpiece he's wearing. But it looks like, but he's a smart guy, right? He says, you know what? It's a lot easier just to kick down the door, and he gets into the building. So lots of examples there of some social engineering techniques that we've talked about. And again, that was a movie called Sneakers, and I'll post that in Blackboard for you if you want to go look at it on YouTube. The only problem with posting YouTube links is sometimes they don't last forever. So by the time you see that link, I put it in the shell, it may not work anymore, but I'll certainly give it a try. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and thanks for watching.